-23 degrees. That's the temperature when human skin begins to freeze in under 10 minutes. That's the temperature when breath turns to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. That's the temperature on a mountainside in northern Minnesota when 12 recruits huddled in their issued tents, shivering so violently they couldn't speak, watching their body heat disappear into the merciless winter night. They were dying. Slowly, quietly, hypothermia creeping through their bodies like a thief. And 50 yards away, an old man sat comfortably in a shelter he'd built from snow, warm enough to have taken off his outer jacket, eating a hot meal he'd prepared on a small stove. They'd laughed at him 3 hours earlier, called him crazy, called him old. Now the instructor was moving the entire squad into his shelter because it was the only thing standing between them and frostbite. If you believe that wisdom doesn't have an expiration date, type survival in the comments right now. Sven Lindqvist was 68 years old, and he had no business being on a winter survival course. That's what everyone thought when he showed up at the base camp, his white beard neatly trimmed, his movements slow but deliberate, his gear old but meticulously maintained. The course was designed for military personnel, law enforcement, and wilderness professionals, people who might need to survive in extreme conditions as part of their jobs. Sven was retired, had been for 15 years. He'd signed up through a civilian program that allowed veterans to participate in refresher courses, a program most people used for the camaraderie and the chance to relive their younger days. Nobody expected him to actually complete the training. The other participants were young. The oldest, besides Sven, was 34. Most were in their mid-20s, fresh from various military branches or police academies, eager to prove themselves in the harshest conditions nature could offer. They looked at Sven with a mixture of respect and pity. Respect for whatever he'd done decades ago. Pity for the old man who clearly didn't realize he was out of his depth. Sven noticed the looks. He'd been getting them for years, ever since his hair had gone completely white, and his face had settled into the weathered map of wrinkles that told the story of a life spent outdoors. He didn't mind. He'd stopped caring what people thought of him somewhere around his 50th birthday, when he'd realized that opinions were like snowflakes, countless, temporary, and ultimately meaningless. What mattered was what you knew, what you could do. And Sven knew things that these young recruits couldn't imagine. He'd grown up in northern Sweden, in a small village above the Arctic Circle where winter lasted 8 months, and survival wasn't a course you took. It was life itself. His grandfather had taught him to build snow shelters before he could read. His father had taken him on month-long hunting, expeditions in temperatures that would kill an unprepared man in hours. By the time he was 16, Sven could survive indefinitely in conditions that would defeat most survival experts. Then he joined the Swedish military, where his skills had been recognized and cultivated. Arctic warfare specialist, 40 years of service in some of the coldest, most unforgiving environments on Earth. He'd trained NATO forces in Norway. He'd advised American Special Operations units in Alaska. He'd survived situations that were still classified, in places that didn't officially exist, doing things that would never be acknowledged. But that was a long time ago. Now he was just an old man with a white beard, moving slowly through the snow while young recruits bounded past him like eager puppies. The course instructor, a man named Captain James Morrison, had pulled Sven aside on the first day. "Mr. Lindqvist, I want to be straight with you. This course is physically demanding. The conditions we'll be operating in are genuinely dangerous. If at any point you feel you can't continue, there's no shame in—" "I understand," Sven had interrupted, his accent still carrying traces of Swedish despite 40 years of living in America. "You are concerned I will slow down the group or require rescue." Morrison had the grace to look embarrassed. "I just want to make sure you know what you're signing up for." Sven had smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Captain, I've been cold before. I will manage." Morrison had nodded. unconvinced, and moved on to brief the rest of the group. He'd seen veterans like Sven before, men who couldn't accept that their glory days were behind them, who signed up for courses like this to prove something to themselves or others. Usually, they dropped out by day 2. He made a mental note to keep an eye on the old man and prepare for an early evacuation. The first 2 days of the course went according to plan. Basic winter navigation, cold weather first aid, proper layering techniques, and the science of heat retention. Sven participated quietly, never volunteering answers, but never making mistakes either. He moved slower than the others on the trail marches, but he never fell behind. His pace was steady, economical, the movement of someone who understood that winter survival was a marathon, not a sprint. The young recruits, by contrast, burned energy like it was unlimited. They pushed hard on the uphills, competed to see who could reach checkpoints first, treated the whole thing like an athletic competition. Morrison noticed, but didn't intervene. They'd learn. The mountain would teach them what he couldn't. On the evening of day 2, Morrison gathered the group for the main event. Tomorrow begins the field exercise. You'll be dropped in teams of 4 at separate locations. You'll have standard cold weather gear and minimal supplies. Your objective is to survive 48 hours and navigate to the extraction point. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. The forecast is calling for temperatures between -15 and -25 Celsius. Wind chill could push that significantly lower. This is not a simulation. This is not a game. People have died in conditions like these. The recruits shifted nervously. The reality of what they'd signed up for was starting to settle in. You'll be issued standard military tents, Morrison continued. They're designed for cold weather use, but I'll be honest with you, in the temperatures we're expecting, they're marginal at best. Your survival will depend on your skills, your judgment, and your teamwork. He looked around the group, his eyes settling briefly on Sven. Any questions? One of the younger recruits, a Marine named Tyler Reeves, raised his hand. Sir, what about building shelters? Snow caves, that kind of thing. Morrison nodded. You're welcome to supplement your tents with improvised shelters if you have the skills and the time. But I'd caution against overcomplicating things. The tents are proven technology. Focus on the basics. Staying dry, staying fed, conserving energy. Sven said nothing, but something flickered in his eyes. A memory, perhaps, or a judgment. The teams were assigned randomly. Sven found himself grouped with 3 young recruits. Tyler Reeves, the Marine who'd asked about shelters. Sarah Chen, a National Guard sergeant with a quick smile and a competitive streak. And Marcus Webb, a quiet wildlife officer from Montana, who seemed more comfortable in the wilderness than most of the others. They were dropped by helicopter onto a snow-covered ridge at an elevation of 7,000 feet, with nothing but white in every direction and a bitter wind that cut through their layers like they weren't there. The temperature at drop-off was -18 Celsius. It would get colder. All right, Tyler said, immediately taking charge. He was 26, confident, with the kind of natural leadership that came from never having been seriously challenged. First priority is shelter. We set up the tents, get out of this wind, then worry about everything else. He looked at Sven. You good, old-timer. Need help with your gear? Sven shook his head slowly, his eyes scanning the terrain with an intensity that seemed out of place on his weathered face. I will not be using the tent. Tyler blinked. What? The tent. I will not be using it. It is insufficient for these conditions. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. Tyler laughed, the sound whipped away by the wind. Insufficient? It's a military-grade cold-weather tent. It's designed for exactly these conditions. It is designed, Sven agreed. By people who have never spent a winter above the Arctic Circle. In these temperatures, with this wind, that tent will lose heat faster than your bodies can produce it. By morning, you will be hypothermic. Tyler's expression shifted from amusement to annoyance. Look, I appreciate the input, but I've done cold weather training before. I know what I'm doing. Then you know that you are wrong. Sven said it simply, without heat or judgment, the way you might correct a child's arithmetic. But it is your choice. I will build my own shelter. He turned and began walking toward a snowdrift about 50 yards away, his movements slow but purposeful. Tyler watched him go, shaking his head. Crazy old man. He's going to freeze to death out there. Sarah looked uncertain. Maybe we should follow the training, Tyler interrupted. Morrison said the tents are proven technology. The old-timer wants to play Eskimo. That's his problem. We've got work to do. They set up the tents while Sven worked alone in the distance. The military shelters were well designed for what they were. Lightweight, quick to deploy, with reasonable insulation from moderate cold. But these weren't moderate conditions. The wind was gusting to 40 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that pushed the effective temperature below -30. Every time the tent fabric rippled, it pumped out precious warm air and sucked in the killing cold. Tyler tried to ignore it. They'd been trained for this. Layer properly. Stay dry. Generate heat through controlled movement. Eat high-calorie foods, all the textbook solutions, but textbooks don't shiver. Textbooks don't feel their fingers going numb inside supposedly adequate gloves. Textbooks don't experience the creeping terror of realizing that the cold is winning. Meanwhile, Sven was doing something the recruits didn't understand. He'd found a spot where the snow had drifted deep, at least 8 feet of accumulated, wind-packed snow that had been sitting long enough to consolidate. Not quite ice, but dense enough to work with. He began by piling more snow into a large mound, roughly 15 feet in diameter and 7 feet high. This was counterintuitive, the opposite of what the recruits expected, building up before digging in. But Sven knew what he was doing. He was building a Quinzee, a type of snow shelter used by indigenous peoples of the far north for thousands of years. The technique was simple in concept, profound in execution. You pile snow into a mound, let it settle and sinter for an hour or two, then hollow it out from the inside. The disturbance of piling causes the snow crystals to bond together as they settle, creating a structure that's surprisingly strong and incredibly well insulated. The recruits glanced over occasionally, watching the old man work. "What's he doing?" Marcus asked. "Building a snow pile," Tyler said dismissively. "Maybe he's planning to hibernate." Sarah didn't laugh. Something about the methodical way the old man moved, the deliberate precision of his actions, made her uneasy, like she was watching someone who knew something she didn't. An hour passed. The recruits huddled in their tents, burning through energy trying to stay warm. They'd eaten their rations, done isometric exercises, done everything the training manual said, and still the cold crept in. Tyler's fingers were past numb. They were starting to hurt, the deep bone ache that preceded frostbite. Sarah couldn't feel her toes. Marcus, the most experienced of the three, had gone quiet in a way that worried the others. "This isn't right," Sarah said, her teeth chattering. "We're doing everything correctly and we're still freezing." "It's just cold," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We just have to wait it out." "Wait it out? Tyler, my hands aren't working properly anymore. If we wait this out, we're going to lose fingers." Marcus spoke for the first time in an hour. "She's right. We need to do something different. This shelter isn't working." Tyler wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The evidence was impossible to ignore. They were dying by degrees, and the tent that was supposed to protect them was nothing but a thin membrane between them and the void. Outside, Sven had finished hollowing out his Quinzee. The shelter was roughly 10 feet in diameter inside, tall enough to sit up in, with a small entrance tunnel that dropped down before rising into the main chamber. This was crucial. The cold air, being denser, would sink into the entrance trench while the warm air from body heat would rise and be trapped in the dome. Simple physics, applied over thousands of years of Arctic survival. He'd smoothed the interior walls to prevent dripping as his body heat slowly warmed the space. He'd poked a small ventilation hole in the roof with a ski pole. He'd created a raised sleeping platform of packed snow because the coldest air would settle at the floor level. Now he was inside, lighting a small stove he'd brought against regulations, heating water for tea. The temperature in his shelter was hovering around 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to be comfortable in just his base layers. Outside, it was -25 and dropping. The recruits found him there. They'd finally admitted defeat, finally accepted that they needed help, finally made the 50-yard walk that pride had made impossible for 3 hours. Sarah pushed through the entrance tunnel first, her movements clumsy with cold, and stopped in shock when she emerged into the main chamber. "It's warm," she said, her voice cracking. "It's actually warm in here." Marcus came through next, then Tyler, who looked around with an expression that mixed relief with humiliation. Sven was sitting cross-legged on the snow platform, a cup of tea in his hands, looking exactly as comfortable as a man sitting in his living room. "Welcome," he said simply. "There is tea if you want it." Tyler couldn't meet his eyes. "How is this possible? It's just snow." "Snow is an excellent insulator," Sven said, pouring tea into metal cups. "Each snowflake traps air. The walls of this shelter contain millions of tiny air pockets, all of them preventing heat from escaping. The same principle as a down jacket, but more effective." He handed cups to each of them, watching as their frozen fingers struggled to grip the warm metal. "The mistake you made, the mistake most people make, is thinking that shelter means blocking the wind. Wind is only part of the problem. The bigger problem is heat loss through radiation and conduction. Your tent blocked the wind but did nothing to retain your body heat. It was like wearing a raincoat in a blizzard, better than nothing, but not by much." Sarah wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her damaged tissues. "Why didn't you say something? Before, when we were setting up?" Sven's expression didn't change. "I did say something. You chose not to listen." Tyler flinched. The old man wasn't being cruel, just accurate. "I told you the tent was insufficient. You told me I was wrong. You told me you knew what you were doing." He took a sip of his tea. "Pride is expensive in the cold. It buys nothing but frostbite." Marcus leaned against the smooth snow wall, feeling the relative warmth of the shelter, slowly bringing his body back from the edge. "Where did you learn this? This isn't in any manual I've ever seen." "Manuals are written by people who learned from other manuals," Sven said. "I learned from my grandfather, who learned from his grandfather, who learned from the Sami people who have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. This knowledge is older than your country. Older than books. It has been keeping people alive since before written history." The radio crackled. Captain Morrison's voice, doing a scheduled check-in. Tyler answered, his voice steadier now, but still carrying the traces of how close they'd come. "Team 4, we've had to abandon the issued shelters. We're currently in an improvised snow structure built by Lindqvist. All team members are present and recovering." There was a pause. "Repeat that, Team 4. You've abandoned your tents?" "Affirmative, sir. Tent was not adequate for conditions. Lindqvist constructed a Quinzee. Temperature inside is..." Tyler looked at Sven, who held up fingers. "Approximately 10 degrees Celsius. We are no longer at risk of hypothermia." Another pause. Longer this time. "Stay in your current location. I'm coming to you." Morrison arrived an hour later, following the GPS coordinates Tyler had provided. He'd heard similar reports from 2 of the other 3 teams, recruits struggling with the cold, shelters failing to provide adequate protection. He'd been preparing to call an early end to the exercise, to admit that the conditions had exceeded safe parameters. Then he'd gotten Tyler's transmission, and he'd needed to see for himself. He found the Quinzee easily, a dome of snow that looked almost natural, like an oversized igloo with a small tunnel entrance and smoke rising from a tiny ventilation hole. He crawled through the entrance, his experienced eyes noting the construction details, the entrance trap to keep cold air out, the smooth walls to prevent dripping, the raised platform for sleeping. It was textbook technique, except it wasn't in any textbook he'd ever used. Inside, 4 people sat comfortably, warm enough to have shed their outer layers, drinking tea like they were at a cafe instead of in the middle of a survival exercise. And at the center of them, calm and unhurried, sat the old man that Morrison had expected to evacuate on day 2. "Mr. Lindqvist," Morrison said slowly, "this is unexpected." Sven shrugged. "Not to me. How long did it take you to build this?" 3 hours. It would have been faster with help. Morrison did the math. 3 hours of work for a shelter that was outperforming every piece of modern equipment they'd issued. That was keeping 4 people alive in conditions that had overwhelmed their standard protocols. "Where did you learn this technique?" "I grew up north of the Arctic Circle. Before that, Swedish military. Before that, NATO Arctic warfare training. I've been building shelters like this since I was 6 years old." Morrison stared at him. Swedish military, Arctic warfare. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was very different from the old man he dismissed on day 1. "What unit?" "You would not have heard of it." "Try me." Sven met his eyes. "1st Ranger Battalion, Arctic Warfare Center. 40 years. I was the chief instructor for the last 15. The silence in the Quinzee was profound. 1st Ranger Battalion, the Swedish Army's elite light infantry unit, specialists in Arctic and winter warfare. Morrison had trained with them once, early in his career. They were legendary, men who could operate indefinitely in conditions that would kill ordinary soldiers in days. And the chief instructor of their Arctic Warfare Center was sitting in front of him, drinking tea, looking exactly like what he was, the most qualified person on this entire exercise. "Chief instructor," Morrison repeated, "for 15 years. 17, actually. I retired at 68. That was some time ago." He said it without pride, without any particular emphasis, just facts. "Why didn't you tell me? When I pulled you aside on day 1, why didn't you just tell me who you were?" Sven considered the question. "Would it have mattered? You had already decided I was an old man who did not belong here. If I had told you my credentials, you would have thought I was boasting, lying, perhaps. Old men telling stories of their glory days." He smiled slightly. It was easier to simply demonstrate. Tyler spoke up, his voice small. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I dismissed you, made fun of you, and you saved our lives." "You did not make fun of me," Sven said mildly. "You made fun of an old man you did not know. There is a difference. You could not have known what I knew because you did not ask. You assumed, based on my age and my appearance, that I had nothing to teach you." He paused, and his eyes grew distant, looking at something only he could see. "This is the eternal mistake of the young. You believe that strength and speed are everything, that the new way is always better than the old way, that the knowledge of previous generations is obsolete." He gestured at the walls around them. "This shelter has kept people alive for 10,000 years. Your tent was designed 5 years ago and it failed in one night. Tell me, which knowledge is obsolete?" Morrison made a decision. "I'm calling off the exercise for the other teams. Going to bring everyone here, to this location. This shelter is the only adequate protection we have in current conditions." He looked at Sven. "I'm also going to ask you to teach. Tomorrow, when everyone is recovered, I want you to show all of them how to do this, how to build a Quinzee, how to survive the way you were trained." Sven nodded slowly. "I can do this, but it will require them to listen, to set aside what they think they know and learn something they think is primitive. After tonight, I don't think that will be a problem." Morrison was right. By morning, when the other teams had been evacuated to the Quinzee site, No one was laughing at the old man anymore. They'd spent the night listening to reports over the radio, teams struggling, tents failing, 2 recruits with frost-bitten fingers who would need medical attention. And they'd spent that same night warm and safe, in a shelter made of nothing but snow, built by hands that had been doing this work for over 60 years. Sven taught them all the next day, showed them how to select the right snow, how to pile it properly, how to let it sinter, how to hollow it out without compromising the structure. Showed them the entrance trap, the ventilation hole, the sleeping platform. Showed them 1,000 small details that no manual contained because no manual was written by someone who had actually lived this knowledge. The Quinzee is not the only technique, he told them, standing in the snow with his breath forming clouds in the cold air. There are snow caves, snow trenches, igloos made from cut blocks. Each has advantages and disadvantages. Each works better in certain conditions. What matters is not the specific technique, but the understanding beneath it. He picked up a handful of snow, let it fall through his fingers. Snow is not your enemy. It is your friend if you know how to use it. It insulates. It blocks wind. It can be shaped and built and formed into whatever you need. The people who lived in the Arctic for thousands of years did not survive despite the snow. They survived because of it. The course continued for another 3 days, but it was a different course now. Morrison had thrown out his lesson plan and turned the exercise over to Sven, who taught them things that weren't in any manual, techniques that had been refined over generations of Arctic survival. He taught them how to read snow conditions, how to predict weather from the shape of clouds and the behavior of wind. He taught them how to preserve body heat through proper posture and breathing. He taught them how to find water, how to build fire in impossible conditions, how to navigate by snow formations and star positions. And he taught them something more important than any technique: humility. The cold does not care about your rank, Sven said on the last day, standing before the assembled group. It does not care about your training or your equipment or your confidence. It only cares about physics. Heat in, heat out. If you lose more than you produce, you die. It is that simple. He looked around at the young faces watching him, faces that had looked at him with pity 5 days ago, and now looked at him with something approaching reverence. The people who survive in extreme conditions are not always the strongest or the fastest. They are the ones who respect the environment, who learn from it instead of fighting it, who understand that nature has been solving survival problems for millions of years, and that the best solutions are often the oldest ones. After the course, Captain Morrison wrote a report that went all the way up the chain of command. It recommended a complete revision of cold weather survival training to incorporate traditional indigenous techniques. It specifically credited Sven Lindqvist as a subject matter expert who had demonstrated expertise exceeding any current military training program. It led to changes that would eventually save lives. Recruits trained not just in modern equipment, but in ancient knowledge, prepared for conditions where technology fails and only fundamental skills remain. Sven didn't know about any of this. He went back home to his small cabin in northern Minnesota, back to his quiet routine of wood cutting and ice fishing and the patient peace of a life well lived. He didn't need recognition, didn't want it. He'd spent 40 years teaching young soldiers how to survive, and this course had been no different. Just one more group of students who had learned what he had to teach. But Tyler Reeves tracked him down 6 months later. Showed up at his cabin with a bottle of good Swedish aquavit and an apology that he'd been working on since that night in the Quinzee. "I was an arrogant jerk," Tyler said, standing on Sven's porch. "I almost got my team killed because I was too proud to listen to someone older and wiser. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry and that I've changed. What you taught me, not just the techniques but the attitude. It changed how I think about everything." Sven invited him in, poured 2 glasses of the aquavit, and they talked for hours about survival, about service, about the responsibility that comes with knowledge and the importance of passing it on. "I'm not angry with you," Sven said eventually. "I was young once. I thought I knew everything too. It takes time to learn that wisdom is not the same as knowledge, and that both of them matter less than the willingness to learn." He raised his glass. "You are willing to learn. That is the only thing that matters." Tyler stayed for 3 days. Sven taught him more. Advanced techniques, subtle refinements, the deep knowledge that can only be transferred person to person, teacher to student. By the time Tyler left, he had the foundation of expertise that would eventually make him one of the military's leading cold weather survival instructors. He went on to train thousands of soldiers, always crediting the old Swedish veteran who had shown him that the best technology is sometimes 10,000 years old. And every time he built a Quinzee, every time he watched a student realize that snow could be warm, he thought of Sven sitting in that shelter on a -25 night, drinking tea, perfectly comfortable while everyone around him froze. Sven Lindqvist passed away at 81, in his cabin during a winter storm, the kind of storm he'd survived 100 times before. They found him in his chair by the fire, a cup of tea beside him, looking peaceful. His funeral was small but attended by people from around the world. Swedish military officers, American special operations veterans, indigenous elders from 3 different countries, all of whom had known him or been taught by him or been saved by techniques he had passed on. Tyler Reeves gave the eulogy. "Sven used to say that the cold doesn't care about your rank or your equipment. It only cares about physics. Heat in, heat out. But I think he was teaching us something bigger than survival." Tyler paused, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had been Sven's home. He was teaching us that wisdom doesn't expire, that the old ways have value, that sometimes the person who knows best is the one you least expect, and that pride, the pride that makes us dismiss people because of their age or their appearance, that pride can kill you just as surely as any blizzard. He raised a hand in salute. "Rest easy, instructor. You kept us warm when we needed it most, and you taught us that the best shelter isn't always the one that looks the most impressive. Sometimes it's just snow, shaped by hands that know what they're doing."